Well, good evening to everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. As those of us who attend here know, we're going through a series of lessons on the minor prophets, and for those of us who may be streaming, I am Steve Choate, a member here at Westside, and have been honored to ask to lead this series of lessons. We've made our way so far through Jonah and Amos and Hosea and sort of got bogged down in Micah. So I'm hoping to conclude with Micah tonight. But one of the bad things about this teacher, at least, is when I'm not actually teaching, I'm tweaking and fiddling and adding. And sometimes I cut out, but not often. And so I did add some material that I hope will be of interest for us as we continue on with our study of Micah. I really don't want a Micah 3, so we'll do our best to conclude with Micah tonight. So a little bit of recap. And I've already shared all of this with you all, but I'm going to do what Brother Dutch does from time to time in his classes, and I'm going to say, I'm just going to read through this. I think that's a good line, Brother Dutch, and I appreciate that. So the author is Micah, whose name means who is like Yahweh, a prophet of the southern kingdom. He is a resident of Moresheth Gath, a place in Judah. It's not mentioned anywhere else in Scripture, about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem, not far from Lachish. And that will be a site of interest for us in the kingdom of Judah. And I'll identify that for you on the map in just a few moments. The date of Micah's ministry falls during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, all kings of Judah mentioned in 2 Kings. And so we date this around 750 to 725 BC. During this time, culminating in around 722, 721 false prophets and avaricious priests of Judah. And that's pretty much the stuff that we covered last Wednesday. Like Amos, for these reasons, he may be identified as a prophet of social injustice. And I'm using the essential structure that you see here, Micah 1 through 3, where Micah is addressing or exposing the sins of Israel and Judah in very powerful language. Micah chapter 4 through 5 deals with the punishment God is about to send, and the focus here is particularly upon the northern kingdom, Israel. And it's explicit here that Assyria is on its way, and that its goal will be really the conquest of the northern kingdom. But Micah also warns the southern kingdom as well, and for the first time, I'm understanding, prophesies that Jerusalem will be plowed like a field. And this may or may not be an impetus behind the reforms that the good king Hezekiah, the son of the evil king Ahaz, institutes. And then Micah chapter 6 through 7, we read of the hope of restoration following discipline. And here's the map that I've been using. So as I've said, I want to point out Lachish, partly because Moresheth Gath is right in this area, not too far from Jerusalem, very close to Philistia off to the east. And also of interest for us here is Ashdod, one of the Philistine cities, because like Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, this too will be the focus of conquest for Assyrian kings. And before I go any further, I want to, I was going to read a little bit from Dr. Lewis's book, but I'm still in the recap mode. So remember that amongst the various things that Micah condemns, I shared with you condemnation that he extends to 4 types of people. And these are avaricious land grabbers, and presumably the king of Israel, Ahab, is an example of this, and taking the land of Naboth, the vineyard of Naboth. That surely was a notorious example of this very thing, because Micah likens these people to cannibals who are killing and eating the poor by virtue of taking their land from them wrongfully. And he also condemns the rulers who hated good and loved evil, chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. False prophets who divine or prophesy for money, chapter 3, verse 11. And greedy priests or avaricious priests who teach for hire, all the while thinking that the Lord is on their side. And that's referenced in Micah 3:11. So he concludes this series of thoughts by pointing out that the land is no longer going to be theirs. They have taken it from others. It will be taken from them. And so the judgment really, the punishment will fit the crime. And that leads to this powerful image, Micah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, where there is a court scene. And the hills of Palestine are really called to be witness. And God is the plaintiff. He brings a charge against Israel, the defendant. And in consequence of that, we read, put in the mouth of the people of Israel, we read these false accusations. With what shall I come before the Lord? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And that is the justification of the people of Israel, that God's ways are unknowable and apparently unknown to them. And in consequence, the weight of guilt and sin is such that they just think that there's no reasonable way to please God. And that last thing, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? There's added point here, as I mentioned last time, because Ahaz, one of the wicked kings of the southern kingdom, offered a son, as we read in 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 3. And this was presumably to Milcom or Molech, one of the Canaanite gods. Ultimately, this god may have come from the Phoenician peoples, because we read of these kinds of things being practiced by the peoples of Carthage in northern Africa, who are also a Phoenician stock. And terrible things being done, particularly under times of extreme duress, when a city is besieged and all of the options seem to be gone, food and water supplies are running low. This is the kind of situation in the ancient world when literally babies would be offered to these cruel false gods. And I described for you, as best as we understand, what Milcom or Molech looked like. Some scholars even debate whether this is a god. Some maintain that the language from which we derive these names may be indications of the type of sacrifice, this extreme kind of human sacrifice. And others maintain, no, there are images of these, and you can find things like this. So I don't honestly know the basis of this, but this is one of the images out there that purportedly shows Milcom or Molech, and this is a colored engraving from the 19th century from some biblical material that shows the bronze figure with the bull's head, the arms outstretched, and a priest is putting into the arms of this image a newborn child, and I don't know if you can make it out, but there's flames all below it. So the idea is that this image becomes really red hot, and you place a child on the arms of that image by way of offering it in sacrifice. This is presumably what is meant by the euphemism of making your children pass through the fire, quote unquote. So it blows my mind to think that any parent could do this to their children, but apparently that was not uncommon on the part of the Phoenicians and the Canaanite peoples in dire situations. Well, of course, this is all ridiculous. We've already touched upon the fact that in Hosea, God laments that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And the context there makes it clear that it's the lack of knowing his desires for them. And so in Micah's text, we have the rhetorical question, what does the Lord require of you? Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Nowhere in the biblical accounts do we have God exacting such a horrible price from his people. The only place we come anywhere close to it is in Genesis, where God tests Abraham by asking him to offer the promised son, Isaac. And we all know from that story that it was a test. Abraham's faith carried him through that test. And before the fatal blow was struck, God stopped Abraham and a ram was substituted. So that's as close as you can conceivably get to that kind of horrible human sacrifice that apparently the Canaanite and the Phoenician peoples engaged in under times of extreme duress. And so the point here, I think, is very simple. God doesn't ask much from us. He asks us to basically be fair and to be merciful and to be humble. Now, all of this, I think we understand that this is not excusing them from the law that was given by Moses. This is really more morality, which is one of the major elements of Micah's message, the immoral, unjust practices that the people of both the northern and southern kingdoms are engaged in. And idolatry is a part of it, and Micah takes aim at idolatry as well. But God is reminding them that they've got to be fair and right to one another. And in that context of being fair and just, and there's a lot of Micah that speaks against the injustice that is going on during this time, to be true to him through their covenant. And that too is implied by this court hearing. Has God been unfair? Has God done unjustly? No, God has kept his promises. Clearly, the inference is that the people of Israel have not. Well, any thoughts or questions about any of that? Sometimes my students say in evaluations, too much time in recap. I think recap is good. It puts us in context with where we are. We learn through repetition. And these are important ideas to reinforce before we go forward. But any thoughts or questions about any of that? I'm doing my best to scan while seeming casual. Okay, I see no hands. So let me share a little bit with you from Dr. Lewis's book that I think helps to set the stage and has the facts and the dates and the names in context more effectively than I can word them from the top of my head. So he says, these years of the 8th century BC were earth-shaking in their significance. The year 735 BC saw the Syro-Ephraimitic War. That's a fancy way to refer to Syria and Ephraim, which, remember, that's one of the names given to Israel as a whole, because Ephraim is in the northern kingdom and one of the largest tribe of the northern kingdom. So saw the Syro-Ephraimitic war as Pekah, the king of Syria, and Rezin, the king of Israel, threatened to depose Ahaz, the king of Judah, for his refusal to join them in a revolt against Assyria. So Assyria is a growing power. And these kings of Damascus and Samaria recognize this. They want to squash Assyria before she becomes too powerful, asks Ahaz, the king of Judah, to join them. He refuses. And so in consequence, these two kings initiate a war against Judah, which is ultimately very counterproductive. They saw the Assyrian machine of aggression dismember Damascus. So Assyria witnesses these things and says, I better pick these guys off one by one before they join. So Damascus, the capital of Syria, is taken apart, and Israel then is the next target for the Assyrian war machine. And so Dr. Lewis says Israel is also dismembered in stages that led to the downfall of Samaria and to the exile of the northern tribes in 721 BC. Ahaz, king of Judah, maintained his state at the price of paying heavy tribute to Assyria, but in 711 BC, the Philistine states were in a state of revolt, which Sargon ruthlessly puts down. So this is extending over a series of years, and there's several kings, actually, of the Assyrian power who engaged in all of this. Sargon is also focused upon Philistia, and he erects a victory stele at Ashdod, fragments of which have recently been recovered. And I'm going to briefly show you that, as well as leaving behind in his palace at Khorsabad records of his victories in Palestine. And that's a real site of interest for Assyrian archaeology as well. Khorsabad, which is sort of the fortified palace that this king Sargon builds shortly after the events that result in the complete dismemberment of the northern kingdom. Dr. Lewis then says all of the dangers came to a climax in 701 BC when Hezekiah, now he succeeded his father Ahaz, raised a revolt that brought Sennacherib, yet another Assyrian king, west to demand his tribute and the surrender of Jerusalem. Siege was laid to Lachish, which is in Judah, which is near Moresheth Gath. The city fell. Sennacherib left to posterity a large picture today to be seen in the British Museum, which depicts his siege of Lachish. And you've got a treat in store for you, because I'm going to show you that one too. He boasts that he took 46 of Hezekiah's walled cities and shut the king up like a bird in a cage in his city, Jerusalem. The fact that Jerusalem was spared at the last moment does not affect the case that Micah's territory was devastated. So Micah's home is at Moresheth Gath, not far from Lachish. And Lachish was a principal target, as we know from the archaeological record as well as from the biblical record, for this Assyrian king Sennacherib. So that brings us to this. This is intended to represent the Assyrian war machine, which was arguably the greatest military power in this particular point in time in the 8th century BC. And the Assyrians, as I've told you, were ruthless, very cruel. They boasted of things that would be appalling by international standards of war today. They not only did them, but they were proud of them. And they decorated the palaces of their kings with really all kinds of bloody texts that describe these kinds of horrible doings, flaying people alive and beheading people, and selling masses of people, the populations of rebellious cities, into slavery. And this was just the way the Assyrians operated. They were one of the most hated and feared people of the ancient world. But as much as I love ancient art, I also love recreations, because they help to bring things to really a sense of reality that I think goes beyond the actual artifacts. And so here's an artist of today attempting to describe a very, very typical scenario in the ancient world where a heavily walled city is being attacked, besieged and attacked by aggressors. And the goal is always to breach the wall, to knock a hole in the wall through battering rams or with siege engines and ladders to scale the walls and get inside so you can take the city. And ultimately, if such a city is invested, meaning fully encircled by the aggressor, all supplies and water cut off, If there is not some relief, that city is going to go through terrible things. Once food and water runs out, it's not unknown in the ancient world to push weak and elderly people outside of the city walls so they have to fend for themselves. It's not uncommon to kill the elderly and eat them, or to eat babies, children. Invariably, disease sets in because of the close confinement within these city walls. Usually ancient cities were quite small by our standards today. And so as death mounts and really plague usually sets in, ultimately such a city will have to be reduced, will have to surrender on the terms of the aggressor. And so this is really never a good situation. Almost always an invested city, a besieged city, ends in being conquered. And for the Assyrians, again, there was very little mercy shown, particularly if the siege lasted very long and frustrated the leader of the forces, whether it be a general or a king, frustrated the men. A sack was very common, where just rampant murder, rape would be going on. The leaders would always be flayed or beheaded or tortured. I could go on, but why bother? Just any atrocity you can imagine would be often exacted by these people. If they were really irritated, they would take such a rebellious city apart stone by stone, and sometimes sow salt, so nothing would grow there ever again. This is complete desolation. And that happened on occasion too. So as I've already shared with you, this is really more than one villain. So let me share with you a little bit about what I'm calling the rogues gallery. I grant you they're all going to pretty much look the same, but believe it or not, these are different people, and we could know that from the cuneiform inscriptions of the writing that can be found on many of these stone reliefs. So this is Tiglath-Pileser III, who initiated the conquest of Israel and Judah. I want you to notice as we're looking through this, they look the same for good reasons. There is almost always in art a canon or a standard that is followed by that given culture or people. And for the Assyrians, physical strength was the great thing. And so as you're looking at these images, you're going to see corded muscles and forearms and bulging muscles and swelling veins. You're also going to see that prime emblem of masculinity, beards, but not the modest little nothing I've got. These, like John Reynolds, these big beards, nicely coiled and curled and oiled, and long hair. Tiglath-Pileser is very, very typical. Sometimes a high headpiece, sometimes for all of the Mesopotamian peoples, these will be surmounted with bull horns, because the bull was a symbol of masculine virility and great strength, and is not uncommonly associated with the divine. So here is the son of Tiglath-Pileser. He is Shalmaneser V, and he began the exile of the northern kingdom. In fact, this is generally considered to be his major accomplishment. He only ruled for a handful of years. He appears to have been deposed by either a younger brother. That was very, very common in the dynastic lines of kings, not only in the ancient Middle East, but all over the world. Or this may have been a complete outsider. Nobody's exactly sure where his successor, Sargon II, came from. But he completed what Sennacherib began by prosecuting the final bit of the dismembering of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and taking the populace into exile. Again, this is something that had been begun by Shalmaneser. Sargon ruled for 17 years, and they were bloody years of conquest. His goal, believe it or not, was nothing less than to be the conqueror of the world. And he was serious about that. He wanted to conquer everybody and rule over everyone. And in token of that, he took a great name, a very old name. The name Sargon is really a title. It's not a name. It means true king. So hundreds of years before his time, there were a people further down south in the Mesopotamian River Valley called the Akkadians. And like the Phoenicians and the Jews, they're Semitic people. They're not quite the same strain of people as what the Bible refers to as the Chaldeans, the Sumerians. They're a different people. But nevertheless, this king, recreated here in this image by a modern painter, took the name, which is really a title, Sargon, true king. And he ruled not only over his own people, centered around what today is Babylon and Baghdad, but he also conquered peoples down to the south, Samaria, or the Bible refers to these people as the Chaldeans. And the artist of today has based his image of this king on the artifact that is supposed to be depicted in pristine state, mounted on a wooden effigy right in front of him. And here is that artifact. This is a copper cast mask that is called simply the head of an Akkadian ruler. We don't know exactly who it represents, but the odds are very high that it is intended to represent Sargon, or perhaps one of his sons or grandsons. It dates about 2250 to 2200 BC. And I don't know if you can make it out easily, but the eyes are badly damaged. Maybe this was an act of vandalism on the part of someone who deeply hated Sargon and his whole line and gouged the eyes out. The eyes are a symbol of intelligence. And more than that, for human beings, they're taken to be a sign of almost divine intelligence and presence of a soul. So the eyes in hated images are often a target for vandals. Alternatively, maybe there were precious or semi-precious materials embedded in those copper eyes, and the vandal gouged them out trying to get the precious material out. But in any case, notice the big curled, oiled beard and the elaborate hair, the fillet of linen on the brow, a symbol, an ancient symbol for kingship. There's added point here because this was recovered by archaeologists not in the region where presumably it was cast. This is one of the oldest examples of metal casting that we have of this caliber, which would be around modern day Baghdad. It was recovered in Mosul, the site of ancient Nineveh. So even for the Assyrians, 1,600 years or more later, this was a famous king. And this image of this king, and presumably this was an image of Sargon, was so revered that the Assyrians took it to their capital, Nineveh, prized it, kept it, such that it was discovered by archaeologists, I think in the late 19th, early 20th century. So Sargon is taking a name resonant of great power, an ancient name and a great title that surely he thought would be befitting the conqueror of the world, as surely he expected his goals to be achieved. There was really nothing that stood in the face of it, given the power that he had with the Assyrian war machine. Only his own limitations of life would prevent his achieving that goal, and they did. So he dies in 705 BC. And he is succeeded by his son, Sennacherib. And we read of Sennacherib and his depredations with the people of Judah in 2 Kings 19. More about that shortly. He consolidates his father's conquests and further secures connections to Judah, exacts tribute. But Hezekiah, as we've seen, decides to rebel against Sennacherib and the Assyrians and that brings Sargon down. Well, there's the rogues gallery, and they are all rogues. And I hope you noticed all of the bulging muscles and the big beards and the curled and oiled hair, because this is part of the standard for Assyrian strength for kings. Well, the big point here and the major prophecy is that the northern kingdom will be destroyed, and those 10 tribes will be taken into really exile, never to return. So this is really, from the Assyrian perspective, a very intelligent way of conquering. You take people out of their homes, you put them in a foreign place where they don't know the resources, they don't know the topography, they're surrounded by other peoples and other cultures, they are vulnerable, they are dependent. And you take other peoples, same thing, turn and turn about, you take other peoples whose lands you've conquered, you put them in those people's lands. And so you have basically 2 conquered peoples who are dependent upon you in your governance over them because they're completely out of context. And that's what the Assyrians and the Babylonians typically would do. Well, that works, doesn't it? That looks like an Assyrian soldier and hordes of peoples of Samaria and the northern kingdom lamentably following him into exile. In reality, if you look really closely, the waters of the Jordan are on either side, and this is supposed to be Joshua leading the children of Israel into the promised land. But I thought, that will work. So this is supposed to be the Assyrians taking the northern kingdom into exile. Okay, so a place of interest for us is the citadel or the palace fortress built by Sargon II after these events have come to a conclusion. And that is, as you see on the map, a little bit south of Nineveh. And it's really a fascinating place. I covered this in my art history classes, and you're actually getting a slice of my art history lecture here. So unfortunately for this site, Khorsabad is the modern name, Dur-Shurukin is the ancient name, which I'm given to understand means the horizon of Sargon, or the city of Sargon. So this is Sargon's fortress palace. Not really a city, although there may well have been the dwellings of common people outside of the fortress walls. And unfortunately, this is in very bad state of conservation, so there's not a lot there today, I'm told. Apparently, a good bit of this was built out of brick, and brick is not as long-lasting as stone. But in any case, you get a sense of the fortified wall with all of the towers. You get a sense of the raised platform upon which is mounted the palace itself. There's a ziggurat or a terraced platform upon which would have been a temple to the god of the Assyrians. The city surrounding the site occupied a square mile. The citadel palace stood above it on a mound 50 feet high. The citadel covered some 25 acres and had over 200 courtyards and rooms. Many of the entranceways into the citadel itself, as well as within the palace, would have been guarded by these great lamassu. And just like the images of men, the convention for the Assyrians is to promote strength, corporal strength. And so we have bulging muscles and swelling veins. But these are not men. The lamassu are the origins of really the Arabian genies, things like that, really demonic spirits. I'm sure some of you heard the stories, some of the stories of the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights. Yes, some of you. Colorful tales from all over the Eastern and Far Eastern world. Well, this is probably the origin of the genie. The idea of the lamassu, a powerful spirit who's really a guardian. And they're usually depicted as this one is. This one actually comes from the site. It's in the Oriental Institute in Chicago. A human head with, again, that great beard and curled and oiled hair. The body of a bull or the body of a lion, and then wings. So the idea is it is a guardian for the king within, a spiritual guardian, not only against any mortal evildoer from the king's perspective who might seek to take his life, but also from evil spirits. And so it has the intelligence of a man, the speed of an eagle, the strength or ferocity of a bull or a lion. That's the idea. So these are guardian figures, and they stand usually about 12 to 15 feet in height. I don't know why I'm raising my arm, because I can't go up that far. But maybe this image gives you an idea. I actually took this in the British Museum. There's a marvelous Assyrian display with two flanking lamassu on either side of a narrow corridor, and then some of the marvelous Assyrian reliefs within. Can anybody see that? Let me see if I can point her out. This girl here, she's head high right there. Everybody see what I'm pointing at? That girl got in front of my picture, and I stood there for some time. She just leaned over and smiled very prettily at me, and I thought, why don't you move? I finally took the picture. I was there several seconds. You know, when you're in a museum, you feel a little uncomfortable, even if you're allowed to take pictures. And so you want to take your pictures quickly, as if you're doing something you shouldn't be. And so it was just a few seconds, but it seemed like minutes. It didn't occur to me until afterward that maybe there was a group behind me who was waiting for me to move to take a picture of her. But anyway, I decided I like her in there because she gives us a sense of scale. These are large, imposing sculptures. And you have to imagine, if your heart is filled with hate, as unfortunately Jonah's was in the beginning of his story, and you want to really do some terrible things to the Assyrian king, and you lived in this time, and you were part of this culture, passing through these lamassu, time after time after time, the odds are that your courage would fail you and you would just freak out and bolt. You know, just forget killing the king. I just can't do this because the spirits are going to get me. That's the idea. Well, again, just imagine corridor after corridor, entranceway, gates, doors, guarded by these things. They were very, very common. They're one of the standard elements that are uncovered in digs in this part of what today is Iraq. These were among the targets of ISIS and their depredations throughout this part of Iraq while the war with ISIS was going on, because as radical Islamists, these people, the Islamists, they feel that this is idolatry, and indeed I understand that, but these are also great works of art. And so many of these were destroyed by ISIS whenever they were in a position to control a city where these could be found. They were, some of them even taken out of museums and just shattered with sledgehammers or blown up. Well, Hezekiah's reforms may or may not have been prompted by the warnings that Micah had to offer. And so I wanted to briefly touch upon that, because as we know, Hezekiah becomes a major figure in the account of the Assyrian aggression exacted against him in Jerusalem by Sennacherib. And so it's interesting to think that that Micah's words, when Hezekiah came into power, resonated with Hezekiah, because Hezekiah acted promptly, very promptly. The first month of the first year of his reign, he began reforming, really, practice of worship toward God, following the rule of his wicked father Ahaz. And we're told that he is one of the great good kings. There's very little in the texts that really speak against anything that Hezekiah does. He called on the Levites to sanctify themselves in token of the fact that their practices and their lives had become impure, to be true ministers of God's worship according to the Mosaic law. He cleansed and sanctified the temple. Just imagine that. The temple apparently had become filled with rubbish and unclean things and had to be cleaned and sanctified. He remanufactured destroyed vessels. We're told that the bulk of these things took 16 days. So again, he's moving very quickly. And it's really tempting to think that the words of Micah may have resonated and reached him upon his accession to the throne. And in consequence of that, he really is in a hurry to get things done quickly. He had the priests offer sin offerings on behalf of the people. He encouraged the people to bring offerings for the further refurbishment and maintenance of the temple. And perhaps most importantly, for the good kingdom, Judah, which has also fallen into idolatrous practices. He destroyed the high places and the Asherah poles. And I've already shared this illustration of a modern artist today of a Jewish man chopping down the Asherah poles in token of the worship of the fertility Canaanite goddess Asherah or Astarte. So interesting archaeology here too. This is a small clay impression. I don't know exactly how big it is, but these are typically about yay big. And this seal impression was discovered in 2015. It bears the inscription, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Was recovered near Temple Mount in Jerusalem, as I said, 2015. Apparently, it was actually around the remnants, the fragments of some kind of document that was necessary for the king to seal. So the exciting possibility is Hezekiah may have had his hands on this seal himself. That's astonishing in terms of the fact that we're talking about events and people that lived 3,000 years ago. I think that's really amazing. Well, the war machine continues on, and as I've already told you, Sargon makes inroads against the Philistines. He sieges and sacks Ashdod, and here are the fragments of the stele or stone monument that Sargon II erected in token of taking Ashdod. And these fragments are today in the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem, and they put us right there at that time. And here is an image of Sargon II and his son and successor, Sennacherib, which came from Khorsabad. So these reliefs were among those that decorated the citadel or fortified palace of Sargon. But as I've shared with you, Sargon dies and his son Sennacherib comes into power, and Hezekiah revolts against him. This is an aerial view of Lachish. And as you see, most ancient cities are built on a mound, or a mound is heightened because of the debris of earlier levels of human habitation. So about 701 BC, Lachish is besieged by Sennacherib. And this is part of Sennacherib's goal of reducing the kingdom of the south, Judah. And of course, the capital is Jerusalem. And so we have actually a primary source record. This is called the Prism of Sennacherib. In fact, it's one of 3 that have come down to us. I don't know exactly how high it is. I really looked for that information. But in any case, this particular one is like the Lamassu in the Oriental Institute in Chicago. It dates about 690 BC. And on this prism, in the fine cuneiform writing, we read, among other things, Dr. Lewis briefly summarized some of this statement. He says, "As for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong-walled cities, as well as the small cities in the neighborhood, which were without number," the text says, "by leveling with battering rams and by bringing up siege engines, by attacking and storming on foot, by mines, tunnels, and breaches, I besieged and took these cities, 200,150 people, great and small, male and female, horses, mules, asses, camels, cattle, and sheep, without number, I brought away from them and counted as spoil. Himself like a bird in a cage, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city." Thus the boasts of Sennacherib. And we have some proof of this from, again, the spade of the archaeologists. So Khorsabad was abandoned, and Nineveh returned as the main focus of Sennacherib's capital. And here you have, from the British Museum, Sennacherib depicted watching the fall of Lachish, one of the minor cities in the kingdom of Judah. And I know you can't make that out very well. This is very low relief. And that's a bit better, but not great. And that's even better. So there's Sennacherib seated on his throne. Behind him is spread out in very flattened form. There's no effort to describe illusory space here. Really Lachish, the besieged city, and all of the Assyrian troops coming and going. There's a man right in front of him, I think you can make that out easily enough, who's reporting to him. There's servants behind him with fly whisks and fans to keep him cool. Incidentally, his face is badly damaged, probably, again, vandals. As I've said, these people were hated and feared. And not only their enemies, but even members of their own family would on occasion assassinate or deface images of kings. You can't make it out well, so I've got a little bit of red box here. There's a bit of cuneiform just above the heads of the men in front of the king. And there it is, 4 lines. And it reads, "Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria, set up a throne, and the booty of Lachish passed before him." So this is the very stuff, the animals and the people that we were reading about from the Sennacherib prism just a moment ago. Incidentally, behind him, there's this fantastic sort of Quonset hut, which is his tent. I think this is amusing. You can't make it out here, but there's a little bit of cuneiform above that as well. And that reads, "Tent of Sennacherib, king of Assyria." Isn't that funny? I'm the only one laughing. See, this is why I rarely make jokes in class. It's embarrassing when you're the only one who laughs. I think that's hilarious. They had to identify Sennacherib, king of the world. Oh, and here's his tent, too, king of Assyria. Well, maybe that makes it a little easier to see. I love these recreations because they bring this to life. So there's Sennacherib in front of his tent, and there are his people. And there are prisoners of war who are being brought before him, and behind the besieged city itself. Well, of course, this is just a minor city. The main goal is Jerusalem. And here's another effort to recreate a scene of a siege. You may be getting tired of sieges, but we're almost out of time, and that means I'm almost done. And so I won't take the time to read 2 Kings chapter 19, not all of it, but it is a fascinating story because it's typical of the ancient world and the overblown boasts of these people. As I've told you, Sargon, the father of Sennacherib, wanted to conquer the world, at least the extent of it that he was aware of. And his son, Sennacherib, calls himself king of the world, very common title for really people with megalomania and overblown egos. And so there's a lot of boasting as the Rabshakeh, the chief servant of the king, comes and makes his demands known to Sennacherib. There's even blasphemy against God, and God is not going to allow for that. In the 2 Kings account, Isaiah encourages Hezekiah by telling him, this is all going to pass away. And so it does. So after all of the boasts and all of the threats, we read in 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 35 through 37, then it happened that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. Talk about tucking your tail between your legs. I don't have it in the text here, but continuing on into verse 37, we get a postscript. Now it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the temple of Nisroch, his god, that his sons Adremelech and Sharezer struck him down with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. Then Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his place. Thus ends Sennacherib. Well, as I've said, this is very common in dynastic lines. One of the reasons why I rarely make jokes in class, and one of the reasons I hate puns, is that my very first joke in class, I was a very tender young teacher, again, knees knocking and voice shaking. I said on one occasion, have you ever heard of dynasties? Ruling families and power? Well, that's often because someone has to die nasty. I got more laughs this time than I did these many years ago. I thought that was funny. That started me on this course of not liking puns very much. Maybe I'm being unfair. It's not the pun's fault anyway. So, a lot of hope in this text, and I want to conclude with hope. And so, again, there's a lot of hope here. So, Micah chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, God not only remembers the remnant, but he makes marvelous promises, not just for the remnant of the northern kingdom. Presumably there were a faithful few who survived, but also the southern kingdom, Judah, who's shortly to be taken into captivity by the Neo-Babylonians. And we read chapter 4, verse 1. And it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths, for out of Zion the law shall go forth. Then they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. Well, for people of that time, I can't think of any better extension of hope than this. And yet there's even more hope coming, because in Micah we get one of the earliest prophecies about the Messiah that is very, very specific. And also very important, because it's actually referenced in Matthew. This was the prophecy that Micah gave 700 years before Christ was born, that led the Magi to Bethlehem. Micah says, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting. So 700 years before Christ is born. That is our God prophesying through Micah. And what a wonderful promise that is. Well, practical application, and I am almost out of time. So even God has his limits. God is defined by his mercy and his love, but the children of Israel, particularly in the northern kingdom, had gotten to the point where God would not ignore their wickedness any longer. And I also am wondering, why do people presume to tell God what he wants? Culminating or elaborating rather upon his will for them. In so doing, why do we determine to make God's plan more difficult than they need to be? And difficult is a mild word when we consider the things that these people were doing in honor of false gods. What are God's demands of his people according to Micah? It's to be just, to be fair, to walk humbly. And just as with them at that time, so with us today, I am not forgetting or excusing the other things. Hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. All of that is a given. But we are supposed to be fair and just to one another and walk humbly before our God. God is just. He punishes the wicked, but extends mercy to those who deserve it. Even in the midst of God's wrath and judgment, he extends hope. And I know there are many, many other lessons that can be drawn from this, but these are, I think, some of the practical applications that I can think of. So we have managed to conclude with Micah. Before next week's class, I would ask you to read Zephaniah, and we will be dealing with Zephaniah next. Let's have a closing word of prayer, please. Father, thank you so much for your word and the light it sheds upon us, not only in terms of ancient times and the punishment as well as the reward that is given to the evil and the faithful, righteous, but most importantly, what it tells us about you and about your love, about your mercy, about your will for us in this life, in this moment, in the 21st century. We thank you for these things, and I pray that you would help us to be of sincere heart, to follow the pattern that you've given us, not attempting to invent or develop our own way to you, but rather knowing that your way is always the best way, striving to worship in spirit and in truth, striving to share the gospel with others so that they too might be saved, because we know that you wish no one condemned. The sight of Christ on the cross alone conveys that and conveys the great price that you are willing to give for each and every one of us in token of the great love that you have for us. Thank you so much for that sacrifice. Help us to carry it with us like a flaming torch in our heart and shining in our lives as we strive to serve our fellow man, to walk justly, to do fairly, and to be humble in your presence and before all men. I pray all of these things in Christ's name. Amen.